No one remembered when she stopped being a person. That was how she survived. For 10 years, Nyla Adeyemi existed without a name that mattered. She moved when told, spoke only when required, and learned how to make her presence small enough to disappear inside any room. Silence wasn't weakness. It was protection. She had perfected it. Her steps were measured. Her gaze lowered. Her emotions buried so deeply even she no longer reached for them. In the world that held her, attention was dangerous. So she became forgettable. The building pulsed with quiet power that night. Men in tailored suits, voices low, decisions heavy enough to reshape lives beyond those walls. To them, she was nothing more than part of the service. A shadow carrying trays. A body that existed only to pass through unnoticed. And she did, until someone looked twice. Not at her face, not at her role, but at the way she moved, at the control behind her silence, at the hesitation she thought no one could see. Park Tae-sung sat at the center of the room, still and unreadable. A man whose authority didn't need to be spoken to be felt. While others focused on power, deals, and dominance, he focused on her. Not curiosity, recognition. When Nyla stepped forward, her hands steady, her breathing controlled, everything remained exactly as it should. Until it didn't. A single glass shifted slightly against the tray. A mistake too small for anyone else to notice. But Tae-sung noticed. Stop. The word cut clean through the room. Conversations died instantly. Nyla froze. Slowly, unwillingly, she lifted her eyes. And in that moment, 10 years of silence shattered. Because the most dangerous man in the room wasn't seeing a servant. He was seeing someone he should have lost. And Nyla realized something far worse than captivity. She had just been recognized. Time had stopped meaning anything to Nyla Adeyemi long before she realized it. Days did not begin. They did not end. They simply continued. Light came and went through narrow windows she was never allowed to stand near. Voices shifted. Footsteps changed, doors opened and closed, but none of it marked time. The only thing that remained constant was control. What to wear, where to stand, when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. In the beginning, she had tried to remember herself. Her name had once felt solid, real, something she could hold on to when everything else slipped. Nyla. It had meaning. It had history. It had a life attached to it. But names require recognition, and no one here used hers. At first, they called her you, then nothing at all. She learned quickly that identity made things harder. It made questions rise, and questions brought consequences. So she began letting it go, piece by piece, quietly, the way one learns to survive drowning by not struggling. The less she existed, the safer she became. Her movements grew precise over time. Every step measured. Every action deliberate. She learned how to anticipate instructions before they were spoken, how to read tone before words formed, how to disappear even while standing in plain sight. Mistakes were not tolerated. Not loudly. That was what made it worse. There were no dramatic punishments. No shouting. No chaos. Just quiet corrections that lingered longer than noise ever could. A hand placed too firmly. A look that lasted too long. A silence that meant she had crossed a line she didn't even see. So she adapted. She trained herself to feel less, to react slower, to exist carefully. Emotion became something dangerous, something that could slip out in the wrong moment and expose her. So she buried it deep, beneath layers of discipline and control. Even pain became routine, not something to fight, something to manage. At night, when the building fell into a softer kind of silence, Nyla would lie still and listen. Not for escape. She had stopped imagining that. But for patterns. For predictability. For anything that reminded her the world still moved beyond these walls. Sometimes, memories came. Uninvited. Fragmented. A voice calling her name. Warmth. Laughter. She never let them stay long. Hope was more dangerous than fear. Hope made you careless. And carelessness had consequences. So by the time 10 years passed, though she no longer counted, Nyla Adeyemi had become something else entirely. Not broken, not weak, but reduced to only what was necessary to survive. A presence without weight, a body without demand, a girl without a name, and in a world that thrived on control and silence. She had become perfect. Obedience had not come naturally to Nyla Adeyemi. It had been taught, not through words but through repetition, through consequence, through the quiet understanding that resistance did not change outcomes, it only changed how much it cost. In the early days, she had still held onto pieces of herself. Small things. The way she stood. The way she hesitated before following an order she didn't understand. The way her eyes lingered too long, searching for something familiar in unfamiliar faces. Those moments never lasted. They were corrected. Not harshly, not loudly, but consistently. A hand guiding her shoulder a second too firmly. A pause in conversation that stretched just long enough to make her aware. Instructions repeated with less patience each time, until she understood that the expectation was not just compliance. It was precision. She began to learn, not just what to do but how to be. Her posture changed first. Shoulders relaxed just enough to seem neutral, never tense, never expressive. Her hands learned stillness, no fidgeting, no unnecessary movement. Even her breathing softened, controlled, as if taking up less space could make her less visible. Then came her voice. She was taught when to use it, and when not to. Answers became short, careful, delivered without tone that could be misread. Questions disappeared entirely. Curiosity had no place here. It invited attention, and attention led to scrutiny. Scrutiny led to correction. So she stopped asking, stopped wondering, stopped expecting. Over time, something deeper shifted. It wasn't just her behavior. It was her thinking. She stopped reacting before something happened. Stopped forming opinions that had nowhere to go. Stopped anticipating anything beyond the next instruction. The future narrowed. The past blurred. Only the present remained, and even that belonged to someone else. Emotion became the final thing to disappear. Not all at once. Slowly, carefully. She learned how to swallow reactions before they reached her face. How to let words pass through her without leaving marks. How to stand still even when something inside her twisted in protest. Anger faded first. It required energy. Then fear changed. It became quieter, less sharp, something that lived beneath the surface instead of rising above it. What remained was control. Clean. Efficient. Necessary. There were moments, rare, fleeting, when something almost broke through. A memory brushing too close. A tone of voice that felt familiar. A silence that felt different from the rest. In those moments, her body would react before her mind could stop it. A slight shift. A breath held too long. But she always corrected it. Always returned to stillness. Because she had learned the truth no one ever needed to say out loud. The more of herself she removed, the easier everything became. And so, over 10 years, Nyla did not just obey. She refined obedience into something else. Something seamless. Something invisible. Until there was no longer a difference between what she was told to be and who she had become. No one ever called it what it was. There were no names spoken aloud. No clear structure that could be traced from beginning to end. What existed was quieter than that. More controlled. A system built not on visibility, but on absence. Things appeared where they were needed. People moved when they were told. And questions simply didn't exist. Nyla had learned early that the world holding her was not a single place, but a chain of them. Rooms connected to corridors, corridors connected to buildings, buildings tied together by people who never seemed to stay long enough to be known. Faces changed. Voices changed. But the rules never did. Everything operated with a kind of polished precision that made it feel almost normal. Orders were given calmly. Movements were efficient. There was no chaos, no disorder. Even silence had structure. Especially silence. Men in expensive suits came and went without drawing attention to themselves. Their conversations were low, controlled, always incomplete, as if every sentence had already been filtered before it was spoken. They never looked directly at anything they didn't need to see. Not the walls, not the doors, not the people standing quietly in the background. To them, Nyla was not a person. She was part of the environment, like furniture, useful only when necessary, invisible when not. She noticed the patterns, even when she wasn't meant to. The way certain names carried weight without explanation. The way others disappeared from conversations entirely, as if they had never existed at all. The quiet shift in atmosphere when someone important entered a room, conversation softening, posture adjusting, attention sharpening, without a single command. Power didn't announce itself here. It was understood. And it moved without resistance. There were layers to it. Nyla could feel that much, even if she couldn't see the full shape. Some people gave orders. Others followed them without hesitation. And above them all, unseen but present, were those who didn't need to speak at all. Decisions reached down from somewhere higher. And no one questioned where they came from. Sometimes, she was moved without explanation. One building to another. One room to the next. No warning. No reason given. Just a quiet instruction and a shift in surroundings that she learned to accept without hesitation.
It was easier that way.
The system didn't rely on force. It relied on certainty, on the understanding that resistance had no place to go, that there was no edge to push against, no clear boundary to cross. Everything was contained, controlled, complete. Even time bent to it. Days blended together under artificial light and measured routines. The outside world became distant, almost unreal, like something remembered incorrectly. Whatever existed beyond these walls no longer reached her. And whatever happened inside them
stayed.
Nyla didn't need to understand it fully. She only needed to survive within it.
So she did what the system required.
She adapted. She listened. She obeyed. And in return, the system did what it always did best. It continued, untouched and unquestioned, swallowing lives quietly beneath the surface of power and wealth, leaving no trace behind. As if people like her had never existed at all. Park Tae-sung did not need to speak to be understood. His presence settled into a room the way silence does, gradual, inevitable, impossible to ignore once noticed. Conversations adjusted without instruction. Movements became more precise. Even the air seemed to shift, tightening just enough to remind everyone of what mattered.
Control.
He did not demand it. He embodied it. Those who worked around him had learned quickly that nothing about him was careless. Not the way he stood. Not the way he listened. Not even the way he remained still, while others spoke too much.
Especially that.
Tae-sung believed silence revealed more than words ever could. People exposed themselves in what they didn't say, in hesitation, in rhythm, in the spaces between actions. And he paid attention to those spaces with a patience that made others uneasy, without understanding why. He rarely asked questions. He observed. And when he decided to act, it was never without reason. The room he occupied that night was no different from the others he had entered before, polished, controlled, filled with men who understood power in its most visible form. Deals were discussed in measured tones. Agreements implied more than they stated. Everything appeared orderly, predictable. But Tae-sung did not trust appearances. He leaned back slightly in his seat, fingers resting loosely against the arm of the chair, gaze steady but unfocused in a way that suggested detachment. To anyone watching, he seemed uninterested. He wasn't. He was listening. Not to the conversation, but to the inconsistencies beneath it. A pause that came too late. A response that arrived too quickly. A glance exchanged when no one thought to look twice. Details most people ignored. Details he collected. Because patterns, once broken, always meant something. That was how he had built everything he controlled. Not through force. Through awareness. Nothing moved within his reach, without leaving a trace. Not a transaction. Not a decision. Not a person. Especially not a person. He had learned long ago that people were the most unpredictable variable, and therefore the most important to understand. Their habits, their fears, their limits. Every detail mattered. And once he saw something, he did not forget it. That was what made him dangerous. Not his authority, not his influence, but his memory. He remembered faces others overlooked, behaviors dismissed as insignificant, moments too small to be recorded, yet too precise to be accidental. And when something didn't fit, he noticed. It was never immediate, never dramatic, just a quiet shift in attention, a slight narrowing of focus, a recalibration of what mattered in that moment. That was all it took. Because once his attention settled on something, it did not move without purpose. The meeting continued around him, voices steady, controlled, unaware of the subtle change that had already begun. To everyone else, nothing had happened. To Tae-sung, something had. Not yet clear, not yet defined, but present. And that was enough. Because he had built his entire world on one simple truth. Nothing that didn't belong would remain unnoticed for long. The night unfolded with quiet precision. Nothing about it was loud, yet everything carried weight. The room was carefully chosen, private, insulated from the rest of the building, where voices did not travel and decisions did not leave traces. Soft lighting settled over polished surfaces. Glass reflected movement without revealing intention. Power lived comfortably here. Men arrived without announcement. No greetings that lingered, no unnecessary exchanges. They took their seats as if they had always belonged there, as if the room itself adjusted to accommodate them. Nyla entered the way she always did, unnoticed. Her steps were measured, silent against the floor. The tray in her hands remained steady, balanced with practiced ease. She did not look at faces. She did not search for recognition. Her focus stayed fixed just ahead, close enough to navigate, distant enough to avoid attention. It was a rhythm she understood.
Move. Pause. Serve. Step back.
Every action aligned with expectation. Around her, conversations flowed in controlled tones. Nothing explicit. Nothing careless. Words were chosen with precision, layered with meaning that did not need to be explained. A sentence could carry agreement. A pause could signal refusal. No one raised their voice. They didn't need to. Nyla moved between them like part of the structure itself. Glasses were replaced before they were empty. Plates adjusted without interruption. Presence maintained without intrusion. She did not exist beyond function. That was the rule. And she followed it perfectly. Her breathing remained even. Her posture neutral. Every movement calculated to avoid disruption. She did not react to sudden shifts in tone or the quiet tension that occasionally passed through the room like an unseen current. She had learned long ago to notice without acknowledging, to hear without remembering, to exist without leaving an impression. It kept her safe. At the center of the table, Park Tae-sung remained still. He had not spoken in several minutes. Others carried the conversation forward, filling the space with controlled negotiation, subtle pressure, quiet assertions of influence. To them, the night was proceeding as expected, predictable,
Contained.
Nyla approached his side without hesitation, lowering a glass with the same precision she had used 100 times before. Her movements did not falter. Her hands did not tremble. There was no reason they should. Everything was as it had always been. And yet, something shifted. Not in the room. Not in the conversation, but in the space between stillness and awareness. It was almost nothing. A fraction of a second where her timing aligned too perfectly, where her control revealed itself not as routine, but as discipline. The kind that wasn't taught in a day, or a month, or even a year. She stepped back, returning to her place at the edge of the room, posture unchanged, gaze lowered. Invisible. Exactly as she was meant to be. The conversation continued. No one paused. No one noticed. The night of power moved forward without interruption, unaware that something within it had just begun to unravel. It happened in a moment too small for anyone else to measure. The room continued as it always did, voices steady, decisions unfolding in quiet layers of control. Nothing broke. Nothing shifted in any way that could be named. Except his attention. Park Tae-sung's gaze, once distant, settled. Not abruptly, not in a way that drew notice. Just a slight adjustment, subtle enough to go unseen, precise enough to change everything. He was no longer listening to the conversation. He was watching her. Nyla remained at the edge of the room, exactly where she was meant to be.
Still. Composed.
Invisible. Her breathing even. Her posture controlled. Her presence reduced to function. But under his gaze, something didn't align. It wasn't her appearance. There was nothing remarkable there. Nothing that demanded attention. Nothing that would have drawn a second glance from anyone else in the room. It was the absence of error. The way she moved without hesitation. The way each step carried no excess, no uncertainty. The way her stillness wasn't passive, but deliberate. Control that refined did not come from routine. It came from survival. Taesung's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition of a pattern he had seen before, long ago, in a different context, under circumstances that did not belong in this room. He did not speak. Not yet. He waited, because observation, to him, was never rushed. Nyla moved again, responding to an unspoken cue, stepping forward with the same measured precision. The tray in her hands remained steady. Her gaze stayed lowered.
Perfect.
Too perfect. She reached the table, lowering a glass into place with quiet accuracy. No sound. No disruption. Just another seamless action in a room built on control. Then, a shift. So small it should have meant nothing. The glass touched the surface a fraction off-center. Not enough to draw attention. Not enough to matter. But enough. Taesung's hand stilled against the arm of his chair. The room continued. No one noticed. But he had already decided. Stop. The word was quiet. It didn't need volume. It carried authority the way gravity carries weight. Absolute. Unavoidable. The room fell still. Not gradually. Instantly. Voices cut off mid-sentence. Movement halted without question. Even the air seemed to tighten, as if the space itself understood that something had changed. Nyla froze. The tray remained in her hands, perfectly balanced. Her posture held. Her breathing paused just enough to reveal what she could no longer fully control. Silence pressed in from all sides. No one spoke. No one moved. Because Park Taesung had spoken. And that alone was enough. Seconds passed. Or maybe less. Time lost its shape in the space between command and response. Then his voice came again. Look at me. Not loud. Not forceful. But final. Nyla's fingers tightened slightly against the tray. A reflex. Quickly controlled. Slowly, carefully, as if the motion itself carried consequence, she lifted her head. Her eyes met his. And everything else disappeared. The room. The people. The silence. None of it mattered. Because in that single moment, recognition settled between them. Not curiosity. Not confusion. Something deeper. Something certain. Taesung did not react. His expression remained unchanged. Controlled. Unreadable. But his gaze did not move. And Nyla felt it. Not as attention. Not as scrutiny. But as something far more dangerous. Understanding. The kind that did not question. The kind that already knew. Her breath caught, just slightly. Enough. Because in his eyes, she saw the one thing she had spent 10 years avoiding. Not power. Not threat. But memory. And in that moment, Nyla Adeyemi understood something with absolute clarity. She was no longer invisible. The silence did not break. It deepened. Nyla held his gaze for only a second longer than she should have. Then instinct returned, sharp, immediate, practiced. Her eyes dropped, her expression smoothing into the same controlled neutrality she had worn for years. It was automatic. Necessary. I apologize, she said quietly, her voice steady, stripped of anything that could be questioned. It won't happen again. The words were correct. They always were. Around them, the room remained still, waiting, not for her, but for him. Every decision now belonged to Park Taesung. Whether the moment ended or continued depended entirely on what he chose to do next. Nyla adjusted her grip on the tray, preparing to step back, to disappear, to return everything to what it had been seconds ago, to undo it. But Taesung didn't look away. Your name. The request was simple. Too simple. It landed heavier than his command. For a fraction of a second, Nyla didn't respond. Not because she didn't hear him, because the answer no longer felt real. There were names she had been called, labels given, replaced, forgotten. Sounds that once referred to her, but no longer belonged to anything solid. Her silence stretched just slightly. A mistake. I don't have one, she said. It was the safest answer, the truest one she could give without giving anything away. A quiet murmur passed through the room, barely audible, quickly suppressed. Not disbelief, not confusion, just the subtle shift of attention when something doesn't align with expectation. Taesung remained still, watching, not her words, her reaction. Everyone has a name, he said. There was no challenge in his tone, just certainty. Nyla's fingers tightened imperceptibly against the edge of the tray. Her breathing remained controlled, but something beneath it shifted, something she could not fully suppress. Memory. Unwanted. Uninvited. A voice, distant but clear. Nyla. It surfaced without permission. She forced it down immediately. I don't, she repeated. Shorter this time.
Cleaner.
Safer. But Taesung had already seen it. Not the memory itself. The fracture. The moment her control had slipped, not in movement, not in posture, but in something deeper. Something internal. Something that did not belong to a servant who had nothing left to hide. His gaze sharpened slightly. Not aggressive.
Precise.
Look at me, he said again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She obeyed. Their eyes met once more, and the room seemed to narrow around them, shrinking until nothing existed beyond that single line of focus. You were taught to forget it, he continued quietly. Not born without it. The words landed carefully, not as accusation, as fact. Nyla's breath caught.
Barely.
But enough. She felt it then, the slow, dangerous unraveling she had spent 10 years preventing. Not visible, not obvious, but present. Her control was still intact, but it was no longer absolute. I serve here, she said, her voice softer now, measured, deliberate. That's all. It was a deflection, a boundary, the only one she had left. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Taesung leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged, his gaze never leaving hers. As if he had already heard everything she wasn't saying. As if the truth no longer needed to be spoken to exist. And that was what unsettled her most. Not his authority, not his attention, but the quiet certainty behind it. Because for the first time in 10 years, someone wasn't asking who she was. They were remembering. The room no longer mattered. Not the men seated at the table. Not the conversation that had been interrupted and never resumed. Not the silent tension waiting for permission to move again. All of it faded into something distant. Because Park Taesung had already made a decision. It showed in the stillness of his posture. In the way his gaze remained fixed, not searching anymore, but settled.
Certain.
He had seen enough. Nyla felt it before he spoke. That shift. From observation to conclusion. You were taken, he said quietly. Not a question. A statement placed with deliberate precision. Nyla's fingers tightened against the tray again, this time harder to control. The reaction came faster than she could stop it, her body responding to something her mind refused to acknowledge. She lowered her gaze immediately. I don't know what you mean. The answer came too quickly. Too practiced. Taesung didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because denial, when it came that fast, was never convincing. It was protective. His eyes moved over her. Not in the way others had. Not assessing value or appearance, but tracing something deeper. Memory aligning with present detail. Fragments fitting into place. A face, older now. A posture, refined by control. A silence, too intentional to be natural. And beneath it all, recognition. You were there, he said, quieter this time. 10 years ago. The words landed heavier than anything before them. Not because they were loud, but because they reached somewhere she had buried completely. Nyla's breath faltered. Just once. Enough. The room felt smaller. The air heavier. Her control still held, but only just. Every instinct told her to retreat, to disappear, to shut down whatever this was before it could take shape. But there was nowhere to go. "You're mistaken," she said. The words were softer now, less certain. Taesung watched her for a long moment. Then, he stood. The movement was smooth, unhurried, but it carried immediate weight. Chairs shifted slightly around the table. Attention snapped back into place. The room, which had been suspended in silence, adjusted instantly to his action. Power didn't need explanation.
It moved.
"Leave," he said. One word. No raised voice. No repetition. The men around the table did not question it. They rose almost immediately, gathering themselves with controlled efficiency, conversations abandoned without resistance. Within seconds, the room began to empty. No one looked at Nyla. No one spoke, because whatever had just shifted did not involve them. The door closed softly behind the last person, and the silence that followed was different.
Contained.
Intentional. Nyla remained where she stood, the tray still in her hands, her posture fixed in place, as if movement itself had become uncertain. Taesung stepped forward, not close enough to invade, but close enough to remove distance. "You disappeared," he said.
His voice had changed.
Still controlled, but no longer detached. There was no trace. No explanation. Nyla's grip loosened slightly. The tray tilted, then steadied. Control returning, piece by piece. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said again. But this time, it sounded different. Not like denial, like resistance. Taesung's gaze didn't waver. "I remember," he said. 2 words. Simple. Final. And in that moment, something inside Nyla shifted in a way she could not stop. Because memory, once recognized, could not be erased again. The past she had buried wasn't gone. It had been waiting. And now, it had found her. Freedom did not arrive the way Nyla had imagined it. There was no moment of release. No door thrown open. No clear lines separating before and after. It came quietly, like everything else in Taesung's world. By the time she realized something had changed, it already had. The room she stood in was no longer the same. Not physically, but in what it allowed. The air felt different. Less controlled. Less watched. Or perhaps the control had simply shifted hands. From them.
To him.
Nyla lowered the tray slowly, placing it onto the table with careful precision, as if completing a task she no longer fully belonged to. Her movements remained steady, but something beneath them had altered. For the first time in 10 years, no one was telling her what to do next. The absence felt unfamiliar, unsteady, dangerous. She did not move, because movement required instruction. And there was none. Taesung watched her in silence. Not with urgency. Not with impatience. Just presence, solid, unyielding, impossible to ignore. "It's done," he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight she couldn't yet understand. Nyla's eyes lifted slightly, hesitation flickering through her control. "What is?" "The place you were taken from," he replied. "It doesn't exist anymore." Her breath caught. Not sharply, but enough to disrupt the rhythm she had spent years perfecting. That didn't make sense. Places like that didn't disappear. They continued. They adapted. They survived.
Just like she had.
"You can't do that," she said quietly. It wasn't doubt. It was certainty. Taesung held her gaze. "I already did." There was no explanation. No detail. Only finality. And somehow, that made it real. The system she had lived inside for 10 years gone. Not weakened. Not threatened. Removed. The weight of that settled slowly, unevenly, like something too large to fully understand all at once. Nyla's fingers curled slightly at her sides. If it was gone, then what was she now? The question rose before she could stop it. What happens to me? It was the first time she had asked anything. Not out of habit, but because she didn't know. Taesung didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained steady, but something within it had shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet present. Less distant. More intentional. That depends, he said. On what? On whether you keep pretending you have nothing left. The words landed deeper than they should have. Nyla stilled. Because pretending had been survival. Because having nothing had been safety. Because identity had been taken. I don't have anything, she said. The statement was quiet, careful, but no longer empty. Taesung stepped closer. Not enough to touch, but enough to close the space between them. That's not true.
His voice lowered.
You have something they couldn't erase. Her eyes lifted again, slower this time. Uncertain. And what is that? Taesung didn't hesitate. Memory. The word settled between them. Heavy. Unavoidable. Because memory meant connection. Memory meant past. Memory meant something she had tried to leave behind was still there. Intact.
Alive.
Dangerous. Nyla's breath unsteady for the first time. Because freedom wasn't what she thought it would be. It wasn't empty. It wasn't simple. It came with something she hadn't prepared for.
Choice.
And standing in front of her was a man who had already changed everything. Not just for her, but for himself. Because the moment he chose to see her, he had stepped into something he could no longer control. And neither of them could go back.